In the past, it clearly was the case that humanists saw a connection between their studies and their commitments in this world. And I'll cite another local example. Robert Goheen was the president of Princeton in the 1950s and 60s, who co-educated the university. Mr. Goheen, before becoming president, he was a classicist. He reread Plato's Republic in Greek with one of his teachers, Gregory Vlastos. They read the passage on guardians in the Republic, in which Plato seems to say, though elsewhere he takes a different position, that women would be just as qualified as men to assume the vital position of caring for an ideal state. They decided that that was what Plato said, not all classicists agreed, and also that they couldn't refute Plato's arguments. So Mr. Goheen went into office at Princeton determined to bring women to Princeton because of something he had done as a professional. It's a wonderful thought, but there's no way you could convince anyone now that there's this kind of congruity between our professional pursuits and larger social problems. I don't know why that is, but I'm pretty sure that that's true. For example, I once came across a filing cabinet full of radio contracts at Princeton. Contracts for the humanities professors of the 40s and 50s to speak on CBS, on national radio, on Saturday afternoon about Locke's Second Treatise of Government, Lessing's Laocoon, Aristotle's Politics. I think it's fair to say that CBS isn't trying to sign me up or their other successors right now. So these older arguments, these arguments that somehow the humanities feed our hearts, the liberal arts, they make us a particular kind of person, no longer seem plausible. The practical arguments, though there are practical arguments, are never going to win against the practical arguments for things like operations, research, and financial management. After all, one student with a degree in operations, research, and financial management can destroy a bank that has existed for 100 years. Humanists can't possibly afford that kind of power. So we find ourselves in a narrow corner with very little rhetorical power to deploy on our own behalfs. That's a serious position to be in, for we are a big claim on resources. Just to remind you of one fact, the library. Libraries were, when I was a student, the place where pretty much everybody went to start a research project. In the science buildings, there were science libraries, and you saw chemists and physicists and mathematicians pulling books and journals off the shelf. The library now is, and in some places is called, a humanities library, because the library is the place where the 8% of us or so who work on texts and images and actually need books for our work go to do our research and teach our courses. That's a small part of the faculty to be demanding all that heat in the winter, all that cooling in the summer, all those new databases, all those old books, and that's where it hurts us not to have powerful ways of explaining why what we do is important. The solutions that are being offered scare me in some ways as much as the problems. There's a language which you hear, not just here, but in Britain. Britain, which used to be the land of eccentric universities. It was the land of where universities looked like Harry Potter's magic college. They did everything but play Quidditch. And the university administrators were just as shabby and just as inefficient as the professors. Indeed, they were professors, and when they were done being administrators, they went back to being professors. Both in the United States and in Britain, the language you now hear is very different. It is the language of the business page. It is the language of the admiring profile of a CEO. Why, you hear again and again, should faculty, privileged, tenured, idle, sterile creatures that they are, be allowed to retain autonomy when efficient, innovative, forward-looking university presidents or university vice chancellors in Britain could do so much if they could only clear out the dead wood and gain those precious jobs which are now being occupied by those who don't deserve to hold them. Now, this is not a new language. It actually was the language of Andrew Carnegie 100 and more years ago, though he softened. It was the language of Ronald Teller Crane, the founder of the Crane Elevator Company, who actually sent private detectives to watch students at Harvard and then decided that what they'd found was too disgusting ever to publish, but did write a series of books in which he denounced universities and university humanists in particular for teaching worthless subjects, for insisting on having long-term jobs, for insisting on their privileges. So this is an old language which has come back to life. And one of the most striking things about it is that it's not actually the language of contemporary business at its most creative. The most creative contemporary businesses, and there are really creative businesses now, they've revolutionized our lives, emphasize not the absolute sovereignty of a single CEO, but space for innovation at every level, teamwork, comity, and in the case of some of the most successful, like Amazon and Starbucks, humane treatment for employees at every single level. Some of them are better than the university at doing that. I don't hear people saying, let's think of Amazon or Starbucks as a model. It's more like General Motors or Chrysler. And I don't really think that's a creative way to think about what we should be doing. Within the university, the main solution we're offered is rapid transit. Luc Menand, in his recent book, The Academic Marketplace, Mark Taylor, in his book, The Crisis on Campus, David Damrosch, in a more thoughtful book, We Scholars, published 15 years ago, argue that the problem is specialization and a system of education which trains people to do specialized work. What we should do instead is insist that education be general, both at the undergraduate and at the graduate level. We should cut the PhD from its current 9 or 11 years to 3 years, 2 years of courses of a general, open kind, 1 year of work on a short PhD. And if we only did that, we would end the crisis of long-term graduate study leading nowhere, of putting people in middle age out on the street with unsaleable skills. Well, I wish this were true, but there already is a system of giving people a general graduate degree and letting them pursue a subject to a certain level. It's called an MA. And I'm not really sure that turning the PhD into an MA would be an effective solution to our problems. You know, you can say buses are good. So if you take buses and you tie them with one another and you put them on a special track, they'd be even better. But it does turn out that all you've done is reinvent the train, which we don't do very well either. And I really don't see that radical foreshortening is going to help us. After all, a lot of what we do in the humanities is actually difficult and technical and takes a long time to master. Reading classical texts in Chinese or Latin or Greek, reading contemporary texts in French or German or Arabic or Italian, reading images, listening in a critical way to music. These are skills that take a long time to develop. When you became a sinologist 30 years ago, you weren't expected to be a fluent speaker of Chinese. Much less were you expected to be a fluent speaker of Japanese. Now you can't be a sinologist without being at fluent teaching level in both of those incredibly difficult languages. Do we want to surrender that? Have sinologists who don't know what the Japanese, who are superb sinologists, say about their neighboring country? The fact that we now have digital means for doing scholarship only makes humanities more complicated. It's not, digital scholarship doesn't replace older skills. It actually requires the mastery of new ones, from programming and building databases to the tools for crunching data that you can actually use when you have, say, a vast body of texts and want to see how a word or an idea shifts over time. So in fact, shortening the PhD, desirable though it would be in human terms, would only be a way of removing or at least sharply reducing its value. That way we can't go. What do? First of all, we have to remind ourselves, and then we have to remind those who govern our universities, those who pay for our universities, those who attend our universities, that the humanities are in part a form of artisanal culture. Just as slow food is better than fast food, slow humanities is necessarily better than fast humanities when it comes to preserving the traditions, which is something that humanists do and that scientists don't have to do in the same way. We have to teach skills that are slow, that are patiently mastered, that don't scale up. And we have to defend them as passionately as we defend the making of unpasteurized camembert in France. It's a great skill, and allowing it to be pushed out of the way by modernization is simply going to produce a product that isn't good. So I think the first step is to say humanities, by their nature, cannot be wholly innovative. We cannot exist wholly in terms of pushing aside everything that's been done, because we're about preserving much of what has been done, and that imposes a duty on us and on our students. So, more practically, what can we do? Well, one thing we could do, and I'm astonished that we haven't, and I'm going to my colleagues in the American Historical Association with a rich program, is to use the wonders of the World Wide Web to make the practical lives of young scholars easier. It is absolutely extraordinary that if you want to apply for jobs in a field of history or art history or most other fields to this day, you have to make a separate application for each job. You have to have your referees send separate letters. You have to get a separate transcript. You have to provide a separate writing sample. The American Political Science Association has made a great beginning with a single database where young political scientists can post their resumes and their accomplishments. Employers can post jobs, and either group can download information. It is absurd that we do not, in creative ways, make the simple processes of job seeking as free and loose and uniform as they could be. And that would be a wonderful way of leveling playing fields between rich universities which can afford to help their students and poor universities where students are left to their own devices. So I think simple, rational, lucid use of the web could do wonderful things. I don't know if there are any postdocs here. Any postdocs? Yeah, there's a postdoc. One of the things my students learn when they apply for postdoctoral fellowships is that no two of them require exactly the same thing. One of them wants a 500-word essay on your teaching philosophy. One of them wants a 750-word essay. One of them wants a 1,000-word essay. All of them have at least 100 applicants for every position. It would not be beyond the abilities of the professional associations to convince postdoc societies to make their requirements uniform. We do this for college admission now more and more. Surely we could do this for postdoctoral fellowships. So there's a lot of simple things we can do if we turn our attention to the problem, which I would argue we haven't been doing, and that is a really culpable point.